All right, so we're going to start Johnny Tremain, or Continue, by Esther Forbes, and illustrated by Lynd Ward, and published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And so we are getting ready to start Chapter 6, Saltwater Tea. And again, great illustrations. This is a ship, and some stuff is going to go down. We just read sections 3 and 4 in the previous video, and so Johnny is getting used to writing for the Boston Observer, and he's becoming a good writer. And then he runs into Scylla, and honestly, his reaction to her is like, this is all positive. He's so happy to see her and Isana. It's just this great kind of reconnection, and he promises that he wants to see them again every Thursday and Sunday afternoon. And she doesn't exactly promise, but he feels pretty certain that he can arrange to meet them. And then there's a lump in his throat, so that's kind of what that means, is he's feeling like emotional about it. Then in section 4, it just talks about his relationship with Rab, and how Rab is very steady, and he's actually learning a lot from him. Rab is questioning, why do you shoot your mouth off at people all the time? Why are you so volatile? Wouldn't it be, better like if you just could count to 10? So Johnny then began to watch himself, and it's like the only time in the beginning when he's actually going to think before he speaks. And when a servant helper at Sam Adams throws dishwater on him, it's the first time he doesn't yell at somebody and bawl him out. And so he's counting to 10. He's like, oh my gosh, I am so mad. But she apologizes, like anybody would. She apologizes. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Let me take care of this. I'll fix your shirt. Here, have a piece of pie. And it all works out to his benefit. So it just shows you that having patience and not shooting your mouth off can really pay. And then Rab and he go to a dance, and he sees a new side of Rab that he hasn't seen before, that he's not always so serious. And then they get in a fight with the butcher's son, and the butcher, and his wife, and the mother. And so the two of them kind of come out the victors, and Rab seems to really enjoy that little incident, because Johnny will see him smiling about it over the next few days. So that's kind of our lead up to Chapter 6, Saltwater Tea. And yes, it is what you might think it is. So on Sundays, the boys might relax a little. Breakfast when they pleased, only they must turn up clean. Only they must turn up clean and shining in time to go to church with Aunt and Uncle and listen to the inflammatory Reverend Sam Cooper. Dr. Cooper was putting more politics than gospel into his sermons that fall, and more fear of taxation without representation than God into his congregation. England had, by the fall of 1773, gone far in adjusting the grievances of her American colonies, but she insisted upon a small tax on tea. Little money would be collected by this tax. It worked no hardship on the people's pocketbooks, only 3 pence the pound. The stubborn colonists who were insisting they would not be taxed unless they could vote for the men who taxed them would hardly realize that the tax had been paid by the East India Company in London before the tea was shipped over here. After all, thought Parliament, the Americans were yokels and farmers, not political thinkers. And the East India tea, even after that tax was paid, would be better and cheaper than any the Americans ever had. Weren't the Americans, after all, human beings? Wouldn't they care more for their pocketbooks than their principles? Shivering, for the last week in November was bitterly cold, Johnny built up the fire in the attic. From the back window, he could see that the roofs of the Afric Queen were white with frost. A sharp rat-tat on the shop door below woke Rab. "What time's it?" he grumbled, as people do who think they're disturbed too early Sunday morning. 7 and past. I'll see what's up. It was Sam Adams himself. When either cold or excited, his palsy increased. His head and hands were shaking, but his strong, seamed face, which always looked cheerful, today looked radiant. Sam Adams was so pleased that Johnny, a little naively, thought he must have word that Parliament had backed down again. The expected tea ships had not sailed. "Look you, Johnny, I know it's Lord's Day, but there's a placard I must have printed and posted secretly tonight. The Sons of Liberty will take care of the posting, but Mr. Loren must see to the printing. Could you run across and ask him to step over? And Rab, where's he?" Rab was coming down the ladder. "What's up?" said Rab sleepily. "The first of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, is entering the harbor. She'll be at Castle Island by nightfall." "So they dared send them?" "Yes." "And the first has come?" "Yes. God give us strength to resist. That tea cannot be allowed to land." When Johnny got back with Mr. Loren, Rab had Mr. Adams's text in his hands, reading it as a printer reads, thinking first of spacing and capitals, not of the meaning. "I can set that in no time. 200 copies? They'll be fairly dry by nightfall." "Ah, Mr. Loren," said Adams, shaking hands, "without you printers, the cause of liberty would be lost forever." "Without you," Mr. Loren's voice shook with emotion, "there would not have been any belief in liberty to lose. I will, as always, do anything, everything you wish." "I got word before dawn. It's the Dartmouth, and she will be as far as Castle Island by nightfall. If that tea is landed, if that tax is paid, everything is lost. The selectmen will meet all day today, and I am calling a mass meeting for tomorrow. This is the placard I will put up." He took it from Rab's hands and read. Okay, now this is the message. Look at the difference in print. That way you know it's something that stands out. "Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detested tea shipped for this port by the East India Company, is now arrived in the harbor. The hour of destruction, of manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny, stares you in the face. Every friend to his country, to himself, and to posterity is now called upon to meet at Faneuil Hall at 9 o'clock this day, that, of course, is tomorrow, Monday, at which time the bells will ring to make united and successful resistance to this last, worst, and most destructive measure of administration." Boston, November 29th, 1773. Then he said quietly, "Up to the last moment, up to the 11th hour, we will beg the governor's permission for the ship's return to London with their cargo. We have 20 days." Johnny knew that by law any cargo that was not unloaded within 20 days might be seized by the custom house and sold at auction. "Mr. Loren, needless to say, the observers will meet tonight. There are private decisions to be made before the mass meeting tomorrow at 9. Johnny pricked up his ears. Ever since he had come to Mr. Loren's, and Rab said he might be trusted with anything, possibly with men's lives, he had now and then summoned the members of the Observers' Club. They were so close to treason they kept no list of members. Rab made Johnny memorize the 22 names. They met in Rab and Johnny's attic. "Johnny," said Mr. Loren, anxious and over-anxious to please Mr. Adams, "start right out." "No, sir, if you please. Noon will be better. That will give the members time to get home from church. And, as usual, Johnny, make no stir. Simply say, 'Mr. So-and-so owes 8 shillings for his newspaper.'" Okay, so it's secret code talk. Johnny nodded. That meant the meeting would be tonight at 8 o'clock. If he said £1 8 shillings, it would mean the next night at 8. £2, 3 and 6 would mean the day after at 3:30. It gave him a feeling of excitement and pleasure to be even on the fringes of great, secret, dangerous events. Today, he could not make his rounds on horseback. A constable might stop him and ask embarrassing questions. There was a law against riding out on Sunday for either business or pleasure. Remember Sunday? Day of rest. The Reverend Samuel Cooper, he dunned as he was shaking hands with his parishioners at the end of the service. He nodded as Johnny told him that 8 shillings were due on the paper, but a fashionable woman standing by said it was a fair scandal for boys to be intruding into God's house and dunning a clergyman. And if collecting bills wasn't work, what was? She would call a constable and have the impertinent imp whipped for Sabbath breaking. Okay, so what they're saying, the author is saying that the Reverend is one of the people Johnny needs to go tell about the meeting. And so when Johnny goes to tell him about the meeting, again, he's sort of faking that he's trying to collect a bill. And so when he says how much the Reverend owes, a woman overhears it and says, "Oh, you're trying to collect a bill on Sunday. I'm going to call the constable and have you arrested." So that's what's happening here. It's rather difficult to understand if you don't really know what's going on here. Okay, so she says collecting bills is work, and therefore she's going to call the constable, the sheriff, and have the impertinent imp, somebody who is willingly breaking the law, whipped for Sabbath breaking. That would be his punishment. Mr. Cooper had to cough so he could pretend not to be laughing, and he winked at Johnny in spite of the dignity of his black clericals, white bands, and great woolly wig. So he thinks this whole thing is very funny because the woman is so upset about Johnny breaking Sabbath. It's like he's getting told about a secret meeting, but we can't say that. "I'll tell my brother William too, eh?" he offered. "Brother William and I will both pay you tonight." Johnny found 4 more of the members also at this meeting and then headed for Beacon Hill. At all the great mansions, he commonly went to the back door, either to leave the newspapers or to, quote, collect bills. A skinny, slippery-looking old black slave in the kitchen told him Mr. Hancock was in bed with a headache. No, she would not permit Johnny to go to his bedchamber. So the boy went to the front door, rang the bell, hoping some other less obdurate servant might let him in. Maybe little Jehu. The old slave guessed what he was up to and got there first. Might he not send a note up to Mr. Hancock? They wrangled a little, and at last she said yes, he might. She was preparing a catnip tea to send to the master. He could write a note and put it on the tray. In the kitchen, he wrote his note. Mr. Hancock owes the Boston Observer 8 shillings. Folded it, and on the outside wrote, John Hancock, Esquire. Was it only 2 months before he had tried to write those very words and failed so miserably? So that's a time lapse. Okay, now they're telling you that 2 months have passed since his almost very bottom, when he had been laughed out of Mr. Hancock's office for failing to write the name. The cook was squatting at the hearth, toasting thin toast. Johnny lifted the teapot to set his note under it. That teapot, its handle was in the shape of a winged woman. Beside it was the creamer that he had loved so much. Even now he could shut his eyes and feel it in his hands. Ah, a sugar basin to match. Mr. Hancock had indeed found a smith to make it after Mr. Lapham failed so lamentably. Behind the cook's back, Johnny lifted it in trembling hands. The handles were wrong, done exactly as Johnny had started to do them before he talked with Mr. Revere. He thought with longing but contentment of that other basin, the one that had been exactly right and never completed. This one he held in his hands was nothing, trash, but how beautiful, how perfect had been the other one. If I had to hurt my hand, I'm glad it was while doing something worthwhile, not merely mending an old spoon. The cook's wiry black fingers were in his hair. "You no account! Don't you never think to go stealing sugar in this house? Mr. Hancock is that generous, I'd have given you a piece if you had asked politely." So the servant is accusing him of stealing sugar, and he's just looking at the sugar basin. Next to the Hancock house was the Lights. Oh boy. Mr. Light, in his effort to play both ends against the middle, that means he's trying to be both Tory and Patriot, did take the Observer. And every Thursday, Johnny habitually crossed from one stable yard to the other. There was no reason he should do so today, because again, he's only delivering the secret meeting news, which Mr. Light is not a part of that. But it was as he told Scylla, he just about couldn't help watching the Lights. What did they do on Sundays? Would the merchant be home today? He might have asked Captain Bull to dine with him. Would he see Miss Lavinia? Or only the fat cook, the scullery maids, Aunt Bess, or the stablemen? The cobbled stable yard was deserted. He did not hear the usual chatter from the kitchen. He glanced at the dining room window, the one Mr. Light thought he broke the night the cup was stolen. Doubtless now that cup Mr. Light had actually stolen from him stood with the other three on the sideboard. His jaw clenched. Sometime, someday, he would get it back, and not by snitching it either. A horse came clattering into the stable yard. Contrary to law and decent propriety, Miss Lavinia had been out for a gallop on the common. That means she's not supposed to be doing that. Decent propriety would be following the rules of civility, and she was out for a gallop. Her black horse was wet and foaming. That means at the mouth, but just because it's hot and sweaty. The young woman sat her side saddle superbly. So it's important that women of rank, so she's a wealthy woman, that she rides side saddle. You wouldn't sit on the saddle like everybody else with legs on both sides of the horse. You would sit side saddle, so 2 feet dangling on one side or the other. And that was what ladies did. Her dark green London habit almost swept the ground, a very long outfit. He knew that she had recognized him as the boy who had stolen the cup the very first time she had met him, delivering papers at her house, but she pretended not to. Now she glanced at him, and the chisel mark between the sweeping black brows deepened. "Williams!" she cried. "Dolbear!" There was no groom at the stable to help her dismount. The black horse reared. Goes back on its hind legs. Johnny smiled. He knew enough about equitation to realize she was showing off. Johnny could make Goblin rear like that any time he pleased. It amused him that she pretended such contempt for him and yet condescended to show off her skill before him. "Well, you then," she cried to him. With her nervous horse and long skirts, it was impossible for her to dismount from a side saddle without help. He gave her the help. She did not thank him. It was as if she knew that proximity to such famous beauty was reward enough for any boy or man in Boston. If anyone thanked, obviously it should be Johnny. He thought she was the most disagreeable woman he had ever seen, and yet the fact was he had slipped thus into the Lights' yard in the hope of seeing her, even risking Captain Bull and that threatened trip to Guadalupe. He liked to tell Rab how awful she was, and then would sneak back to take another look. Nearby was William Molyneux's house. Its seedy appearance advertised to the whole world that its owner was close to bankruptcy. Mr. Molyneux was standing in his orchard, shaking his cane at a couple of small boys he had treed in an apple tree. He had a terrible temper, which he thoroughly enjoyed. Although Johnny told him 3 times about those 8 shillings, he was not sure whether the idea had penetrated the wild Irishman's thick skull or not, nor did he care. His good friend Josiah Quincy, plump little John Adams, and James Otis he found together at the Quincy house. They were still sitting over their port and cracking nuts. James Otis did not even look up when Johnny entered. He was hunched up in his chair, his thick-skulled, heavy head hung forward. He was busy drawing a row of little people on the paper before him. Quincy, having already heard about the meeting that night, put a finger to his lips like shh, and shook his head like mm-mm, at the same time glancing at the heavy, lonely figure of Otis. Johnny guessed that neither he nor John Adams wanted Otis notified of the meeting, although he was a member. For 4 years, Otis had been crazy and sane, turn and turn about, on again and off again. He was the most brilliant man of them all, thought in largest terms, not ever merely of Boston, was passionate in his demand for the rights of Englishmen everywhere, over here, and in Old England too. Now he was not even listening to what was going on about him. His heavy head was swinging back and forth. John Adams and Josiah Quincy were watching him so intently, their heads were also moving a little. Johnny stole out and closed the door softly after him. He guessed that in a day or two he'd hear it whispered James Otis had gone into a mad freak and fired guns from the windows of his house. James Otis had been seen leaving Boston in a closed chaise with a doctor and in a straitjacket. That means like crazy, like he lost his mind and he needs to be wrapped up because he's out of control. Next he went to Dr. Church. Here was a queer man, surely. He was still in his bedgown and slippers, with paper, inkhorn, and pens about him, writing poetry. Johnny did not care for Molyneux because he bellowed and roared so loudly, but he disliked Dr. Church. He did not know one thing against him, but he felt the man was crooked, and he knew that Paul Revere and Joseph Warren felt as he felt about Church. Dr. Warren was in Roxbury tending a sick woman. His wife bade Johnny come back at 5. And that's the end of section 1 and the end of this video. So click subscribe and watch the great math videos and more of Johnny Tremain. See you on the next one.